How to control other countries the US ways. There is a way for strong countries to get rid of leaders from other countries that they don't like. We call this a coup. It's a French word that means a punch or a blow, which makes sense since it means to come in and punch a government out of power. There were no votes and no process. Someone just took over and someone else took over. Hello and welcome to today's video, where we're going to discuss about the topic, how to control other countries the US ways. But before we dive into that, make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon to get notified whenever I upload a new video. And if you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. There are many different ways that coups can happen, but I want to show you how the US has used coups to get what it wants on the world stage. So, let me tell you about some of the most important coups that the US has led over the years. This will show you that even though it sometimes seems like we live in a world with lots of rules and order, the most powerful countries often get what they want by any means necessary. The first thing is that they did well. There have been a lot of failed coups. We're not going to use those. Second, at least one member of the US government must be involved in the coup. And number 3, we need proof, not just guesses, that the US was actually involved. Even though the US has tried to change a lot of governments around the world, we ended up with a much shorter list. These are the coups I think best show how this tool has been used to gain power around the world over time. Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines. Let's start here, in the separate country of Hawaii, with its warped, cheesy Hawaiian music. In 1893, the US thinks that the Hawaiian queen could make it harder for them to control sugar. Sugar is grown by the children and grandchildren of white American preachers who moved to Hawaii many years ago. So, the US sends a military ship with a lot of soldiers to Honolulu, where they remove the queen and make Sanford B. Dole, a son of Christian preachers, the new president. Take note of his name. Yes, this was one of the US's first coups. It made it possible for the family of the new president of Hawaii to grow their strong foreign business, which was based in Hawaii. It also made it possible for Hawaii to be acquired or added to the US. Let's look at the map again. There's a lot more to talk about with these coups. Spain is involved in the next coup. Well, more like the islands Spain had. Spain's days of glory are long gone. Their kingdom is on the way down, and their colonies, especially Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, are fighting back in big ways. The US, on the other hand, is becoming a bigger power. And the fact that Spain has bases about 100 miles off its coast already makes them feel pretty bad. But at the same time, they don't like the idea of Cuba or Puerto Rico being truly independent. These islands are important to the US because they are right next door. And just like in Hawaii, American companies have money invested in Cuba, especially if they want to be on their own, they might get kicked out. So, the US gets involved in this war between Spain and its subjects. They say it was an attack because an American Navy ship blew up, even though it was probably a mistake. But stories can be more important than the truth sometimes. So, the US sends troops to free the rebels fighting against their Spanish oppressors, offering them freedom not only in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but also later in the Philippines and Guam. The local protests finally get rid of the Spanish. But the US always breaks its word to give these people freedom. And they figure out ways to rule Cuba and Puerto Rico indirectly by themselves. The US just took advantage of several freedom movements to carry out several coups at once. This let them put pro-American leaders in power and build a Navy base in Cuba, as well as take control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines for 48 years. Let's keep going. Nicaragua, Honduras. Okay, so we're in Nicaragua, and the year is 1909. There are a lot of big American companies here, but when a new president takes office, he promises to regulate them. This won't happen, says the US. So, the Secretary of State starts spreading stories about this president, saying that he is building a tunnel that will compete with the Panama Tunnel. But the real reason they are angry is that Nicaragua took loans from Europe. The US keeps making this person look like a war criminal who should be kicked out. So, when push comes to shove, the US sends ships to both sides of Nicaragua. They gather a lot of Marines in Panama to show Nicaragua who's boss, and tell the president to step down. And the fact that it worked means that, as a growing leader, he has no choice but to step down. Soon, a leader the US likes will take over. The takeover is done. And really, this is just the first time the US has messed with Nicaragua. After a few years, the US is back in the area to help with another coup in nearby Honduras. This one was planned by a group of private American people, and it follows a similar scheme. In this case, a new president is directly influenced by the president of Nicaragua, and he wants to take control of the country back from American companies. In this case, bananas are in question. The companies that make bananas were not going to let this happen. And it was mostly this guy, Sam the Banana Man, who ran a banana business. No way is he going to let this annoying boss run his country. So, he puts together his own army, buys a Navy ship that is no longer needed, fills it with guns, and starts a campaign to get this president out of office. He sails from New Orleans to the coast of Honduras, where he invades the country with something like a private army. Oh, really? How does the US government fit into all of this? They also didn't like where the government of Honduras was going. So they just kind of stood back and let this private attack happen. The US then comes in at the most important time to call for a stop to the fighting, basically forcing the president to step down. He couldn't move forward or defend himself, so he quit. The Banana Man's choice for president takes office. He gives the banana businessman land and a special position. That lets him bring in anything he needs without paying taxes. And, wait for it, he pays back the Banana Man for all the costs of the coup, with Honduran public money. This Banana Man took over the government and made Honduras pay for it. Wow! So, let's move on to the 1950s, when the coup becomes a more useful tool for the United States. There's a new US body whose job is to get information from all over the world and analyze it, which is code for spying. They call it the CIA, which stands for the Central Intelligence Agency. And it changes everything about how a coup is done. Oh, and at this point, the US is a full-fledged superpower around the world. No longer just looking at their own area. They now look at the whole world map, and spend a lot of money fighting their global enemy and its communist ideas. Iran. This brings us to Iran in 1953, when a new star leader named Mohammad Mossadegh had just been elected. He comes to power because he thinks that Iran needs to take back control of its most valuable natural resource, oil. At the time, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British company, was in charge of all of Iran's oil. Today, we call it BP. Mossadegh has had enough. Let's get rid of the British and get our oil back, they said. But, like the US, Britain doesn't like it when Iranians try to get back their resources. So they tell them that there will be consequences if they do this. So, when the CIA's Middle East guy was going through London, the British met with him quickly and told him about this idea. Let's get rid of Mossadegh, they said. The CIA said, okay. They thought Mossadegh was a bit commie because he wanted to nationalize Iran's oil. Or at least that's what they tell themselves. So the CIA agrees and sends this guy to Iran in secret. He is in his 30s and is in charge of the Middle East Bureau. His name is Kermit Roosevelt. Oh, and he is the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, who was also a big player in a coup. Roosevelt gets into Iran and is given $1 million from taxpayers to use in any way that would bring about the fall of Mossadegh. This means that there are now hidden CIA spies in Iran trying to overthrow the government. And at first, there are a lot of problems and mistakes. But they start to use their money to get attention by paying politicians, religious leaders, and other powerful people to say things about Mossadegh that are divided and controversial. They pay local people to attack religious leaders in a way that looks like Mossadegh told them to, but in reality, the CIA is paying them to do this. And if they have enough time and money, they can make the public feel like chaos, anger, and mistrust. Also, there are guns. The CIA stores enough guns and bombs to support a 10,000-person guerrilla organization for 6 months, just in case they need to start a full-scale war. All of this leads to more bloodshed and chaos in the city as a whole. People are getting beat up, shops are being burned down, bullets are flying into mosques, and thousands of paid protesters are flooding the streets. All of the chaos in the city is caused by money from the CIA. All of this leads to a bloody shootout at Mossadegh's house in the end. He gives up in the end and goes to the police. He was put through a fake trial and found guilty of treason. He was put in solitary confinement for 3 years and then put under house arrest, where he stayed until he died. Mohammad Reza Shah, whose name means king, was the last ruler of Iran. He left the country. But now that Mossadegh is gone and he has the support of the US and UK, he could take control of Iran by chartering a trip back there. The Shah puts on his own crown, which is a 2,500-year-old custom. He is called King of Kings and becomes the emperor of his country. The US really won this one. What they wanted happened. They now have an American-friendly tyrant running a powerful country in the Middle East. This country has one of the biggest oil supplies on Earth, and American oil companies are welcome to use it. Iran turns into a brutal police state when the Shah is in charge. He killed military leaders, student leaders, and anyone else who had anything to do with Mossadegh. He made a hidden police force, and life was very hard for everyone. So bad that in 1979, Iranians were so angry that they took to the streets in mass protests and drove Shah out of office. He was replaced by an exciting new leader, who would turn Iran into an Islamic republic, in part because they were angry that the US had meddled in their country. Since then, the Islamic Republic has been in charge. It has changed into the harsh theocracy we know today. But that might not last for long. Before we go on, it's important to remember that none of these coups or plans to get rid of other countries' leaders needed votes, agreement, or approval from Congress. Most of the time, this was done by just a few key guys in government buildings in Washington, D.C. These people would go on to shape the Cold War and many secret activities around the world, many of which we'll never know about. Guatemala. Alright, let's move on. The next year, in Guatemala, the CIA tried to use the same playbook that they had used in Iran. They again went after a leader that the people had elected, but who wanted to take back the country's resources for the people, and break up American monopolies that controlled the country's electricity and railroad. Even worse, the president starts to take land from a huge banana company. He wanted to give empty land to people in the area, so they could grow it and feed their families. This would help them get out of the cycle of poverty that was common in the country. But the US decided that they had to protect the banana companies because if they didn't, more communist changes would spread. So, the US President and Secretary of State told the CIA to get rid of the government. The CIA picks a man they want to be in charge. And then they start giving Guatemalan refugees and private soldiers weapons and training. On the edge of Miami, they set up a secret action camp. They begin sending weapons to Panama Canal. But just like the other coups, this one can't be about guns alone. They have to own the area for knowledge. So, they make a radio station that sounds like it comes from Guatemala, but is actually run from a small town in Florida. And they start spreading fake news about a revolt, an uprising, or some other kind of trouble. Then, at the same time, Guatemala was attacked by fighters that the CIA had taught and supplied. Pilots start dropping bombs on airports, military bases, and fuel tanks. But they weren't really starting a war. They didn't really want to hurt anyone. They wanted it to feel like an uprising at home or like a war was coming up. To scare people, and for many, it worked perfectly. They thought this was a real uprising and had no idea that it was all planned by the CIA. But he knew what was going on. He had messed with the US. And now he is hearing about it. The big bully from the north is putting pressure on the military leaders in his group. So they turn on him, and he gives up in the end. On his way out, the president speaks to his people and makes it clear that, quote, the United Fruit Company, in collaboration with the United States, is responsible for what is happening to us. And just like that, one president is out and the chosen CIA choice is in. This new government is harsh and does horrible things, like locking up people they thought were communists, killing prisoners, and breaking up labor groups. In the process, they return land to the banana company and make sure they keep their control over the economy. This starts a period of more political killings and unrest in Guatemala, which is still a problem today. Still, there is no proof to this day that the Soviets were ever even slightly interested in Guatemala. Again, communism was used as an excuse, but the real reason was to protect American business interests. which meant breaking a country apart over bananas. Bananas are the best because they taste the best and are the best for you. Africa, Caribbean, Vietnam. Okay, let's go to Africa. So, it's 1960 in the Congo, a country in the middle of Africa. They just got their freedom from Belgium. And this guy, Patrice Lumumba, wins the election and becomes the prime minister. But right away, in Washington, the communist warning bells start ringing. This is because we are in the middle of the Cold War. And Congo has a lot of natural resources, including a lot of uranium, which is the main ingredient for nuclear bombs. This is happening at a time when many Americans keep gas masks by their beds and store a lot of canned food in their basements. And Washington leaders can't take the chance that the Soviet Union will take over Congo. So they begin to pay attention to this prime minister. The CIA chief called him, quote, an urgent and primary goal that should be a high priority of our covert action. So they pulled off a bigger political coup than they had before. They start to work with Lumumba's political rivals and with Belgium, which used to rule Congo. They buy off officials, pay for protests and labor groups, and spread lies, which are all things that were used in the earlier coups. And when the time is right, all of these leaders who have been bought off do what the CIA told them to do. They would get rid of Lumumba, and the CIA would be there to help the new government with money, information, and advice. This political answer wasn't the first one tried. The CIA had tried to kill Lumumba before, but they all failed. So, they turned to hijacking and manipulating Congolese politics, a brand new democracy, and supporting the people who would eventually put Lumumba in front of a Congolese and Belgian firing squad, making this a political assassination that was helped from across the ocean. And yet, these coups are so complicated. In this case, it's hard to show that the CIA's help was the main reason why Lumumba was killed. It's still talked about. This is how a foreign-backed coup works. It works in the shadows, stokes divides, and appeals to the worst fears of the people on the ground with money and power. Okay, let's move on to the 1960s in the Caribbean. The leader of the Dominican Republic is a cruel tyrant. I mean, this guy is just terrible. People say that he feeds his enemies to sharks. But no matter what worries the US is that a communist movement could start at any time. So, the CIA gives guns to a group of hitmen and tells them to kill this person. It turns out to be a trap and a car chase. They are able to get rid of him, putting an end to his 31-year rule. And in the end, the US sends troops to invade the doctor to stop a leftist candidate from becoming president. They bring back order, and in the end, a candidate who is friendly to the US is chosen. Vietnam. Okay, so now we have to go back to 1963 and go to Vietnam. And boy, this one is way bigger than we have time for. But we're trying to focus on the coup part of it. Vietnam was split in two, with communist and pro-Western leaders in each half. The US needs the South to stay on their side. But Washington is losing faith in the South's leader, because he is losing control of the country. The US is worried that communism will take over all of Vietnam. So the CIA rolls up its sleeves, because it's time for another move. This time, they focus on a South Vietnamese general, who doesn't like the president either. And he agrees to do the CIA's work. When he gets the word, the general tells his troops to take over the airport, radio stations, and roads. They march to the presidential house, where there is a bloody shootout. But President Diem gets away. He is with his brother, but things aren't going well. So he sees he needs to set up a meeting to give up. The meeting will take place at a Catholic church. This was probably going to be a quiet meeting, but when the generals show up, they just kill him on the spot, saying, "To kill the weed, you must pull up the roots." This means that Diem must die in order to solve the problem. Not even exile was enough. The US didn't plan for this to happen, though. No one wanted to kill this person. It wasn't an official order from Washington. But they pulled off this coup. People say that this makes JFK very sad. The first Catholic American president was behind the coup. That killed the first Catholic leader of Vietnam. And, by the way, 20 days later, JFK was killed. And one national security journalist says that the killing of Diem had a bigger effect on American history than the killing of JFK. because it kept the US involved in a long war in Vietnam for a decade. That ended in an embarrassing loss and a political crisis at home. One of the few times the US had to deal with what happened after a coup. Brazil. Okay, let's move quickly through a few of these. I'm going to leave out some specifics. Brazil is on the verge of becoming a communist country in 1964, as a new leader from the left comes to power. The CIA is lucky that there is already a plan to get rid of him. So US armed ships just show up off the coast of Brazil. A lot of ammo and materials are brought in by air. In the end, they didn't have to do much. Instead, they sent in more troops and just watched the Brazilian coup happen. The boss from the left falls, and a new one takes over. Chile. In 1973, there was a coup in Chile, which is a very difficult story with different reports. We went down a very deep rabbit hole to find out more. But we've chosen to cut it short because the proof isn't rock solid. I'm not saying that crazy stuff didn't happen, though. Libya. Okay, we're back in Africa, and it's the 1980s. And here in Libya, ruler Muammar Gaddafi was causing a lot of trouble in the area by giving money to terrorist groups and trying to grow his power all over the area. Then, his friend Chad calls and asks for help stopping a rebellion. Gaddafi sends 4,000 men to take a large part of the country, and makes friends with the new president by helping him send his foe away. Soon, Gaddafi will get greedy and try to take over Chad. The US doesn't care about this. So Ronald Reagan starts up the well-oiled coup machine by starting a secret war, sending weapons and money to rebels in Chad and backing that political opponent, who was ousted, and helping him fight back, and it works. The president of Chad has to flee, and the leader backed and supported by the US takes over. This causes a conflict, and the CIA keeps arming the war even after this leader is in power. The new boss, who is backed by the US, rules harshly for 8 years, until a military officer gets rid of him. He was also accused of crimes against humanity, abuse, and war crimes in 2013. Grenadian. Now, let's go back to 1983 and visit this small island. Communism is back. So the US sends 2,000 troops to attack a small, remote island and get rid of the communist boss there. They didn't know much about this small island, so they used tourist maps to plan how to take it over. Even so, when the US troops move in, they beat down the Grenadian fighters, who are helped by their Cuban friends. The government falls, and a leader who is friendly to the US takes over. Panama. So, let's go back to Central America. We are in Panama in 1989, where the US is in charge of a very important canal. And luckily, the leader of Panama has been very helpful to the United States. But the US starts to doubt this guy and wonders if he's really the best choice to make sure they can keep easy access to their important canal. Oh, and the fact that he was charged in Florida with drug dealing and moving money didn't help. We have to let him go. But when Panamanian troops killed an innocent American soldier in Panama City, that was the last straw for this guy. The US is done with this guy. So they send 27,000 troops into Panama to get rid of him. The military of Panama is destroyed, and the tyrant is caught and sentenced to 40 years in jail. The US still gets access to its canal. Afghanistan. Okay, so now it's the end of the 1980s, and the Soviets are invading Afghanistan. They are met by a group of fighters from all over the world, who have come to Afghanistan to fight back against the Soviet occupation. And many of them are religious fundamentalists. But it doesn't matter to the US why they do what they do. They only care that they are ready to fight against the Soviets and the Afghan ruler, who is a puppet of the Soviets. And it works great. With help from the US, these troops are able to push back the Soviets and get rid of the Afghan president. And as he's being voted out of office, he tells the Americans that if they leave Afghanistan in the hands of these fighters, it will be turned into a center for terrorism. His prediction came true in every way. People like Osama bin Laden and Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who started the group that became ISIS, were among the fighters who were paid by the US. Those same weapons that the US sent to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets and change the government were used against American troops years later, when the US tried to change the government again after 9/11 against the same groups they had helped in the past. When the US finally left Afghanistan, the Taliban took control of the country again right away. Iraq. It's the year 2003, and 150,000 American troops have just invaded Iraq. They say they are there to find and destroy weapons of mass destruction. But their real goal is to get rid of Saddam Hussein, which they do in a few weeks. Saddam went into hiding, and President Bush said, "Mission accomplished." He then set up a government in Iraq that was friendly to the United States. Unfortunately, this alienated large parts of the Iraqi people and army, who then formed anti-American rebel groups that fought against the American occupation. Some of these groups later became ISIS, which still causes a lot of trouble in the region. Iraq is still a place where politics are very unstable. Very few people trust the government. And there are still no good answers to the questions of how and why we did this expensive, horrible, and damaging coup. Now we're at the last move on our list. It's 2011. And there's a wave of protests going on in this area. They're trying to get rid of all these strongmen tyrants, like Muammar Gaddafi. The same Gaddafi we talked about earlier who looked like he was going to take over Chad. He's still around, and he's still a really bad guy. People are afraid that he might kill all of these people who are protesting for freedom. So, the US thinks it needs to help save these protesters. They ask their NATO partners for help, but at some point, the goal changes to a complete change of government. Only the people in the room know exactly how this happened. But is it a shock? We've seen the US use coups as a way to get their way in foreign conflicts for a long time. It's a tried and true part of the United States foreign policy. So it shouldn't be a surprise that a coup becomes an answer when making hard decisions. So, Gaddafi becomes the target, and NATO drones are now shooting missiles at his vehicle. He is finally caught and killed on the spot. Since then, Libya has been in chaos. But it wasn't like it was a great place when Gaddafi was in charge. Again, we're in a murky area where we don't know what events didn't happen, or how things might have been different if the US hadn't gotten involved. This argument still goes on. So, that's the list. In this video, we chose to talk about our coups. We could have talked about so many more, though. I put together this long list of American-led coups, one after the other so that we could see trends. How a growing giant got really good at getting rid of leaders who didn't share their view of the world or, in many cases, didn't help American business interests. But let's be clear. This wasn't made in the United States. This is something that has always been done by strong countries and powers. During the Cold War, US-led coups were defined by how the overthrow of these governments often put an end to new democracies and democratic movements, replacing them with authoritarian leaders who would go on to oppress the people. With the help of the US and changing the country's history in the process. Russia has been meddling in the US election process lately. And I've been thinking about how I feel about that. The fact that an outside power is spreading doubt, division, and fear in my own government and society is a crime. It feels like a huge breach of trust, and it is. This is giving me a small taste of what it must be like to have an outside power pull the strings in your country, tearing it apart for their own purposes, and making more problems for the people. And for the US as a whole, all in the name of keeping the US on top and dominant over the rest of the world. That's all video information for today. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Please subscribe, share, and like this video if you like it. Farewell and enjoy many good days.